Good morning and welcome to the fourth session of our KoalaCollab Conference Series for 2021. My name is Jeff Lundy-Jenkins and I'm the Director of Southern Wildlife and Koala Operations within the Department of Environment and Science. And I'll be the MC for this and the next two sessions as we move through the KoalaCollab Conference Series. Before we start today, I'd first like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which each of us attends today's virtual event and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and acknowledge their ongoing connection to country and the biodiversity it supports. Broader than that, I also want to acknowledge the significance of koala populations and habitat to First Nations people. In developing the South East Queensland Koala Conservation Strategy, we've been fortunate that First Nations people have shared their knowledge and shared their stories during the formation of this strategy. The government thanks those who have participated in this process. We acknowledge that these stories are sacred and that the protections of the koalas is deeply embedded in the culture, language, spirituality and identity of First Nations people. Also want to acknowledge the land and sea rangers across South East Queensland who work to protect koalas and their habitat and who, through their connection to country, weave a unique and valuable perspective to educate and inspire others to value and look after our koala populations. As we move forward in implementing the Queensland Koala Strategy, the government is keen to continue to seek out new stories and partnerships to co-design initiatives and practical strategies that respect the traditions and reflect First Nations people's deep knowledge of country. Today's event is the fourth in our series of 6 themes conference sessions, which are split over 6 weeks and builds on the success of the inaugural KoalaCollab event that was convened at Lone Pine in 2018. Today's 4th session explores the theme of securing, protecting and restoring koala habitat. To kick off today's session, we're pleased to be able to have Dennis Ganaway from Healthy Land and Water with us this morning. Dennis will be presenting in relation to working with community to achieve better koala outcomes. Dennis is a team leader of the landscape restoration team within Healthy Land and Water and has worked with the Australian environmental sector for the past 20 years. His work has focused on the catchment-wide management of invasive species to promote the conservation of Australia's unique native species and protect agricultural production systems. Dennis has filled various roles over the years, including delivering the weeds of national significance, coordination of the asparagus weeds, delivering the 2 million trees project with the Redland City Council, and running scent detection dogs training at finding fox, wastewater and invasive species. Dennis is currently delivering a large-scale habitat protection works within South East Queensland aimed at protecting koala habitat, and that program is funded via the federal government's Bushfire Recovery Fund. So I'll just introduce Dennis and he'll provide his presentation.
Thank you very much. Good morning. Thank you very much. So this morning we're going to have a look at the aspect of working with community and delivering programs via community. Presentation outline, we're going to look at 2 distinct projects that were being run, one being run by Healthy Land and Water, as mentioned earlier, funded via the federal government, and the second one on a community initiative that was driven out of one of the smaller local community groups that Healthy Land and Water supports and works with. The first one, the basis of a lot of these are going to be whether the mapping for koalas was present and driven some of that engagement with the local landholders and community. And the second one is the absence of that mapping and how that has impacted and affected our delivery of programs. So just to kick off and set the scene, a little background to Healthy Land and Water. We, the South East Queensland Natural Resource Management Group, it's an amalgamation of the old SEQ catchments and healthy waterways. Organisation's been here for around 5 years now as a single entity. Our guiding principle on what we do and all things that drive our work is the SEQ NRM plan, the Natural Resource Management Plan, which is currently under review. Healthy Land and Water has a fairly broad-based remit. We work in the water quality, erosion control, sustainable agriculture, as well as individual species conservation. A lot of our work is aimed at that behaviour change type of area, where we're looking to get landholders to change practices to either improve water quality or maintain and restore conservation values on their properties. So focusing on the first of the projects, this is a project run by Healthy Land and Water. As has been mentioned, it's a singular project funded out of 2 distinct buckets of money. The first is the Environment Restoration Fund, the federal funding. That's of the 4 projects that are listed above on the screen. That one's funding the Flinders Peak project, and that's a 3-year project. The other 3 target areas or projects are being funded out of the Bushfire Recovery Fund. They are 1-year projects. So we need to think about why we chose those particular areas. Those 4 areas were chosen specifically after a very in-depth infer process, a process which had a look at a broad range of mapping of habitats of known sightings of koalas, and Healthy Land and Water worked with the state government and various other entities that deal with koalas to develop up this prioritization of where, if we spent $1, where would we get the best investment for our money, and the investment being the best return for koala habitat. If we have a look at the map, what happened was we're looking at these small, let me just blow that. We're looking at these areas in the hatchings where the analysis of all of the koala habitats, and the koala habitats being the orange being the priority areas, the darker colors being the natural areas. We came up with 13 areas around South East Queensland which were priority quality areas, and ranked them by their in order of priority. The first priority, of course, was the Flinders Peak area. We then had the areas in Grantchester, North Pine, and North Lakes. Each of these projects were then developed specifically to take action on those on the priority areas within those areas. Obviously, landholders become our most important. Let me just within these areas, the most important delivery method that we have is to engage with the private landholders. In each of these areas, particularly in Flinders and Grantchester, we had to develop projects which incorporated the landholders and worked across many tenures. We were fortunate in the North Pine and in the Lake Manchester area that we only had to work with one entity, which was SEQ Water, because they were the major landholders and the bulk landholders within that area. So we'll, for the process of this presentation, we'll ignore those for the moment and just focus on dealing with the private landholders in Flinders and in the Grantchester area. So just to orientate anybody who's not particularly familiar with this area, Brisbane City's in this particular area, Ipswich, and this is that spine of green that runs up through South East Queensland. Having identified all of our areas and our priority areas through this desktop study, we then took a step back from that and had a look at, within these areas that have been prioritized for works through our desktop study, which are the land parcels within those particular areas that we should target. So we did a secondary study within each of those prescribed areas in which we were going to work, and we had a look at landholders that met certain criteria, such as remaining vegetation, sightings of koalas, the size of the property within these target areas, and we listed those. From those about 150 odd people that we identified, we needed to engage with them. Our first method of engagement was to send out an expression of interest to those landholders, requesting some really detailed information and trying to ascertain whether they were willing to work with us. And the willingness to work with us is incredibly important, because working with a landholder who is going to value what was happening on their property and continue that work in the long term obviously makes it more of a priority work with that particular one, rather than a recalcitrant who's not likely to follow up on works that have been undertaken. So the expression of interest went out. We also conducted a series of workshops across the region, targeting specifically groups that are active in that, such as your community conservation groups, any one of those community where we could stand up in front and encourage people to engage with us through the expression of interest or directly. We did a very large and targeted social media and traditional media advertising campaign focusing on those areas. And importantly, where we knew that we had important landholders, large-scale landholders that were already engaged, such as through the Land for Wildlife program, or had expressed interest or worked with us in the past, we did a direct approach to them to get an understanding of what exactly they were willing to do and allowed to be done for the project. I think one of the areas that I possibly skipped over is why these projects were important. These 4 areas, these refugia, if you will, were identified and created with the idea that should in the future we have another event such as a catastrophic fire or loss of vegetation, these 4 areas would be kind of like an arc. This is the last area where we would have healthy populations of koalas, where we would have we could defend to protect koalas in the event of adverse weather or fire. And these would be the areas that we could use to potentially populate out once good conditions returned. So it was really important that we had the landholders in those areas engaged and willing to contribute. The net result of all of this work, this is the Flinders Peak area. Flinders Peak is a mountain and a conservation area just south of the village of the city of Ipswich. Several pressures around this area. It's one of the fastest growing urbanization areas in Australia, I believe. Very large urbanization pressures coming through that way. The end result is of all of our desktop surveys and our going out and engagement is that we were able to then establish exactly which properties were willing to engage with us and where they lay within our target area. Every one of these properties within our target area, which is essentially the area bounded by the green, was ranked. The higher the ranking, 56 plus, the green meant that there was a great deal of intact vegetation left on those properties. So the analysis is done by each of these property boundaries. The lighter the color down to the white, meaning essentially the less valuable the current koala habitat is. The yellow boundaries are all of the positive responses we got from our EOI process and the landholders that were willing to engage with us. So as you can see, we of the 120 odd we sent out, we got back around the 25 mark. Our objective and our deliverable for this particular area was to be able to enhance about 130 hectares of habitat and improve that. Now that improvement included weed work, it includes taking out of fences to allow movement, it may be exclusion fencing, or it could be actually replanting to create corridors. So there's a variety of actions that we could have taken on the ground. As you can see from this map, what we got was quite a pleasing result from our landholders. We had everybody who was willing to let us work within very high valuable and intact vegetation, but probably more importantly, if we have a look at the areas where the landholders were bounded by or situated in areas which had very poor existing habitat for koalas, this allowed us to develop projects which are focused very much on developing all those corridors or improving that. We know from experience that while there's a very large resident population of and stable population of koalas within the Flinders Peaks crossing area, this area up here called Perga also contains quite a significant population of koalas, and there's significant movement between these two. Therefore, working with these landholders on the boundaries to improve connectivity, to reduce hindrance of movement, we became very, very important. The black hatched areas on this map here indicate areas where these are going to disappear under housing in the next decade or so. So any works in those areas obviously were removed or not taken as a very high priority. So what did we end up with? Essentially what we had is up in the high hills and the slopes, those green areas where we had a lot of very good and intact. Our major issue to contend with would have been fencing and old disused cattle fencing. But in the main, it was lantana, and the removing of lantana thickets to, first of all, allow for better movement within those areas, but also to obviously allow for regeneration and natural regeneration of habitat and food trees. Now, these areas that we would be working in, some of these properties and the larger properties were still grazing properties, marginal at best. Not high productivity areas up in the mountains up through here. The engagement with the local landholders there was very much as a conservation, looking for that conservation outcome. These areas had not been cleaned up or cleared because they're not particularly productive. Therefore, not a high priority for landholders to work with and work on. We went in and are currently clearing out these about 120 odd hectares of lantana. We'll maintain that for the next 2 years. However, it's going to take that agreement and that longer term agreement with landholders who are going to be doing this voluntarily to mop up and keep clearing up after we have moved out of those properties in the next 2 years, so that natural regeneration that we have started will get a chance to get up and above the weed line in future. So this is very typical of the type of terrain that's been worked with up in the on the hill slopes in the what is mapped as higher value. As we get down into the flats, those are those areas that were of lighter colors. They're showing up poor because they're rich soils, a lot of horticulture, a lot of vegetable growing, and typically we get this kind of outcome, which is heavily cleared areas, grassland grazing, for instance. So this is down on the flats. What we did do was we sent the detection dog through all of these areas and the areas where we had identified on the EOIs, to ascertain, first of all, whether there was koalas were in fact using those areas, and that was really focused here on these lower flats where we had these isolated stands where people weren't convinced that koalas were actually in those areas. So putting the detection dog on there, finding the proof, showing them the proof that yes, indeed, the koalas are using these isolated stands, really got them across the line and got them engaged very, very quickly. So on these flats, what we're looking to do would be to establish stepping stone corridors between these isolated stands, as you can see, and the more heavily vegetated creek lines and corridors, which we know are used for movement across these landscapes. This map here is really to illustrate just how important, I think, working with community and getting on the ground and talking to landholders is when you start kicking the dirt on the properties. This is out at Grantchester. These two properties here were identified as important corridors for us, just to put people in place of where this is. This is the Hidden Vale complex, which has a lot of research and extensive research happening on koala particularly. These properties up here have great evidence of koala, and we know that there's movement corridors through here. We started working with these particular two landholders to create a corridor movement back into the Hidden Vale area. Ran the dog on those areas, got engagement, started talking to them. We were informed that this gentleman who owns this property here was very difficult to work with, hadn't been successfully engaged in the past. Once he saw us working on the other side, curiosity took the better of him, and he actually almost demanded to be involved, which allowed us to develop a much bigger and stronger corridor through that. So the power of talking to community, the power of action on one side of a fence can certainly drive people to engage on the other. And not to downplay the role of all the staff, but using the detection dog, that's a SCAP that he's handing on, is a really good way of engaging and breaking down fences. So that project that we've just gone through is very much around looking at maps, understanding where the maps are, allowing for prioritization using the map. This particular project I want to show you is actually a community-driven one. It's not, the funding's not coming through Healthy Land and Water. It's coming through the Queensland Government to the Logan and Albert River Catchment Association. Healthy Land and Water is playing a small part in supporting them. But this project is very much around developing an understanding of where koalas are in the landscape outside of what is mapped. So the target area for this particular project is between Bow Desert in the Logan Valley and Rathdowney. What we're looking at the moment is the mapping, the available mapping at the time from the state government showing remnants and potential habitat regrowth. But if we focus on the remnant, the community within this area were very, very concerned that there was a very clear and known understanding that koalas were regularly using roadside vegetation, isolated trees, etc., within the Logan Valley. But the concern from the community was that there was very, very little protection for them or their habitat trees because that area was not mapped, and they were looking to strengthen that mapping to use it in future for protection of particular areas, potentially funding, potentially getting action on the ground. The whole premise of that project was driven from some research that was done in South East Queensland in Mount Byron, where radio-collared koalas were shown to be using these isolated paddock trees and roadside vegetation. So this program was trying to replicate that process, but at a community scale, not at a at a research scale. So the first initiative that was undertaken was the detection dog was sent out into farmland, particularly engaging with farmers who had these standalone trees in the middle of paddocks. And what we and the community group were trying to prove was that koalas were indeed utilizing these trees. So the detection dog was deployed on a selective farms to search out these particular isolated trees. And as you can see, there was a great result where scratches and scats were found throughout the target area. Again, just to orientate yourselves, that development there is Bow Desert. That's the Logan River running down through there. So the first effort was to check the isolated trees using an almost foolproof method of the detection dog. The next two efforts to prove usage and distribution of koalas across that particular area was very, very much community focused, community based. So the Mananjali Men's Group, which is a traditional owner group operating out of Bow Desert, a men's support group, were approached and trained what to look for evidence, so scratches, scats, etc. We trained them on how to use GPSs, and they did roadside vegetation surveys particularly around the paddocks in the fields where we deployed the dog, so that we could try and start ascertaining movement corridors. So if the koalas were using the isolated trees, where were they entering the field? Where were they exiting? That was the idea. And the men's group then did a survey of all those designated rural roads through the target area. And then to try to get a broad brush approach to and involve as many people as we possibly could, we developed an iNaturalist project on the iNaturalist app, ring-fenced that to a particular area, held a workshop in conjunction with the Wildlife Society of Queensland, and asked as many people as possible to take pictures of scats, claw marks, and koalas themselves throughout the region where they found them. The net result of the roadside surveys, the guys didn't always get the tracking on the GPS right, but we started to collect some really good data. So all of these arrows are where they found, photographed, which we verified, and GPS points of either scats, scratches, etc. on trees on roadsides. So that began to build a really nice picture. And the iNaturalist, the uptake of the iNaturalist was surprisingly good from our perspective. We had 40 observers, and this is probably a couple of months out of date at this point in time, but about 83 observations across the entire area. So one of the strengths of iNaturalist is that you can also then pull up all of these dots or where those sightings occurred. So the objective, as we said earlier, was to try and develop up a map for the community that showed the combining all of these three collection efforts, that really showed in a very simplistic way where the koalas were, and more importantly, where the activity was against what is currently mapped and known. So working with Healthy Land and Water, this map was developed. All the teardrops and the red dots are the observations that were made over the time period. These are obviously the priority, and then those were overlaid over the vegetation mapping and the priority areas. And the objective here is very much to arm the community with a document that they can then take forward to funding bodies, to advocacy groups, to whoever they see fit, to be able to indicate very clearly that there is koala activity within areas outside of the mapped areas, and that they can then develop up programs going forward on that. This particular program is one of the first year of two. So this first year, we've essentially created this baseline of sightings. Year 2, the same exercises will be replicated again, but there's going to be some extrapolation and trying to work out where movement corridors are from these, based on these sightings. So just in closing, a couple of lessons learned through working with community and putting these projects on the ground. Landholders in the community are willing to assist if they're asked, and I've put the if they're asked nicely. And certainly from our experience, if you can sell a story to the landholder about how benefiting a particular species is not going to impact him or her on their production or access to their land, but they're still contributing to the general good, we seem to, following the 80-20 rule, we seem to get majority of people on side and willing to cooperate. The other learnings is that the community is very, very happy to use apps. I think if coronavirus has done anything, it's meant the use of apps and QR codes, etc., on smartphones is now commonplace. Tools for online data capture are available. They're becoming very, very accessible, and again, apps are being driven it's been driven by the accessibility of apps. There's access to the data, the state government data, the mapping, etc., is easily accessible. And this is a shameless plug because that's my dog. The use of detection dogs, not just because they can find things, but also they're very cute and they're great icebreakers, and you can get onto property with a cute dog very much easier than just with a project officer. So that's my presentation. Thank you very, very much for allowing us to showcase what we're doing, and happy to answer any questions.
Thanks very much, Dennis. Certainly a lot of project work going on in that space, and really valuable collaborations you've identified. A couple of questions have come up. First, well, actually the first two questions relate to the types of protections that are in place on private land and other land that's involved in your projects, just to protect the longevity of the work that's being undertaken to restore and protect koala habitat.
Very important question. The short answer is there are no protections in place. So our counterparts in northern New South Wales are putting covenants on the land that they're working on. Here in South East Queensland, us as an entity don't have that capacity to force people to put covenants, etc., on the land. It probably drives why we have to be very careful of who we work with, and the selection of who we work with then becomes very, very important. One of the drivers that we do find is very powerful is that land for wildlife type of program, where we can go on a property if they're not already there. At least we can get them involved into that land for wildlife organisation, working closely with the local council officers, and get some long-term protection in that way. But at this point in time, we don't have any legal way of enforcing long-term maintenance of the work that we do. It's reliant very much on finding the right people to work with.
Yeah, thanks for that. You may have touched on this later of your presentation, but there was also some interest in the way in which you've engaged with the community to get them involved both in the planning of these projects and also then in implementing the projects. Again,
our expression of interest was worded in a way which really asked people how they felt about koalas in the landscape and how engaged they were in the conservation of koalas. So it was a little bit biased, so that we picked out the people that had a great deal of interest initially, The planning, once we'd identified the willing, if you will, the planning of those programs was very much walking the land with those landholders. Look, we want to clear every weed and pull out every fence on their property. That's probably not going to be what they're looking for. So that finding that compromise position where we get enough hectarage under management to make a significant difference to the habitat quality and not impede to the point of economic loss to the, or an unacceptable economic loss to, say, a grazier, have been incredibly important. So that initial planning work is done face to face. We've also found if you keep to the agreement, you do what you say you're going to do and maintain those properties and that area that you're working in the longer term, you tend to get a lot of cooperation from your landholders. The planning is very much our objective, meeting the expectations of the landholder and then coming to a compromise position on that.
Okay. I know in response to the first question, you mentioned that you didn't have any specific legal mechanisms for locking in those protections. Questions come up about, I guess, are you encouraging landholders to explore some of those voluntary mechanisms in terms of
Yes.
covenants and nature refuge and those types of things?
Yeah, very much so. So all of our discussions about that would include these are the options available to you. Land for Wildlife is probably the simplest. If we engage with that, then we'll move up and try and encourage them to lock up that land under covenant.
Yep.
But we can't force them.
Okay, we've got two more shorter questions. One is, are there job opportunities available in the work that you're doing, in the projects you're doing?
We are reliant very much on contractors to deliver. So specifically for us, no, but certainly we're generating a lot of work for local weed and fencing type of contractors. So we have project officers on the ground. It is generating, and one of the outcomes from the funding is that we use local people, local contractors, etc., to generate work on the ground. Is there work with us in Healthy Land and Water at the moment? Unfortunately not.
Yeah. Okay, and the final question for the session was, what's your dog's name?
That's Danny.
Okay.
Danny the dog.
Good, nice and simple. Thanks very much again, Dennis, for taking your time this morning to present to us. The second presentation is by Catherine Dexter from the Redland City Council, and will highlight the Council's Wildlife Connections Plan. Catherine was going to present live to us this morning. However, there's been a few technical challenges, so we've had to rely on a pre-recorded video that Catherine prepared for her presentation. She'll be available for Q&A after the presentation. Catherine's an ecologist and a conservation biologist with over 15 years' experience as a koala researcher and project management in urban ecology research, with a particular emphasis on koala movement. Catherine's current role with the Redland City Council is as the Koala Conservation Project Officer. And a key focus for Redland City Council is to stabilise the Redland Coast koala population by 2027. This we achieve through a series of strategic conservation activities that will include landscape-scale habitat planning and robust monitoring of koala populations to measure fine-scale change. Catherine is a founding member and current committee member of the Australian Network for Ecology and Transportation Conferences, and is a PhD candidate with Griffith University's Centre for Planetary Health and Food Security and the School of Environmental Science. So I'll now transfer over and we'll look at Catherine's presentation.
Council is presenting on securing koalas in the landscape and how Redland City Council plans to connect wildlife and enhance habitat in the coming years. I'm going to turn off the camera now as there is a lot of delay in this recording, so bear with me. So Redland City Council has adopted a number of plans over the last or several years, and those plans include the Koala Conservation Strategy in 2016, our Wildlife Connection Plan in 2018, and the Biosecurity Plan in 2018. That's been followed by our Basin Creek plan in 2021, and they all sit under our natural environmental policy. These plans have been adopted to assist our environmental operations to forward plan the actions around weed management, ecological restoration, community engagement, acquisitions of land, our environmental offset planning, and our biosecurity undertakings. We have also developed strategic priority area mapping to help us have a timely focused attention to particular areas, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. So Redland City Council is taking a landscape approach to species conservation as we move forward. So landscape scale conservation is much talked about, but it is an area where, although it has many benefits, there are numerous issues. However, our overarching aim is to take a more coordinated approach and a broader approach to addressing the environmental issues, and in particular for at-risk species, and that does include koalas. So our benefits that we've been focusing on is that we can target our conservation efforts at that landscape, even at a landscape scale, and by developing corridors, we're able to enhance our habitat and create linkages, and hopefully the outcome is that we'll have a greater chance of preserving our current species and providing and safeguarding our ecological function. The issues that we have to contend with is that there is a poor understanding on how to achieve it, particularly in local government settings and actually across all government settings. Conservation is often too localised and too piecemeal in its efforts, and hopefully taking this landscape approach will help us broaden our focus. Threat mitigation also is something that is often poorly planned, too localised, often reactive and not based on science or ecological principles regarding the species of interest. And there's a lack of general commitment from government at all levels around legislation, policy and funding to really undertake landscape scale conservation. However, Redland City Council believes this is the next step in securing habitat and really trying to mitigate some of those major threats that our natural areas are facing. Before I move into the presentation proper, I want to talk about roads. Roads are the most pervasive threat to nature globally. The impacts of roads are many, and some of them include obviously those changes to the landscape, the entire dynamics of those landscapes, including impacts on hydrology, soil and waterways, habitat loss and fragmentation through the building and upgrading of roads. It reduces ecological function and functional connectivity being one of the main issues. The chemical and noise and dust pollutions that come from road is well understood, as are the barrier effects and edge effects for species. Species who suffer from road avoidance or attraction, leading to wildlife and human injury and mortality, species decline and extinction from impacts from roads. And roads, the introduction of roads into areas brings pest species and includes even poachers. And so the list is long and it goes on. Yet all of these impacts are really ill-considered when it comes to conservation and the cumulative effects of roads on nature across the landscape. There's also a tendency to try to fix the problem at site with tools such as fences and underpasses, and there's an over-reliance on focusing at hotspots to mitigate the impacts of wildlife. So we feel that the mitigation strategies need to be planned wisely so that we can maximise the cost to obtain those ecological outcomes that are goals, and that's where Redland City Council is trying to focus some of our attention. So we're thinking big. And, sorry, lost my train of thought. When it comes to transport, and infrastructure planning, we create networks of roads and rail and transport modes in a hierarchy based on an importance in regards to moving people for economic and social reasons. We plan many years ahead, and we allocate significant funds to these goals. Why don't we apply the same importance to environmental impacts by roads? So that's the challenge. We feel that landscape planning needs to be generational in nature and achieved over decades. So as you can see by these two slides here, we are looking at where we can start to make some inroads and look at ways of creating linkages across our landscape. I'm sorry, I can't make this click through on this particular presentation. So we've got some big picture thinking. So the wildlife connections plan and our strategic planning and area mapping tool are the cornerstones for Council's environmental planning. It provides a focus for our major adopted plans around the Koala strategy, our biosecurity plans, our Basin Creek plan, and other natural environmental initiatives such as our 1 million natives plans by 2020. It gives us an opportunity to integrate our considerations of the land and riparian corridors. So to include, at that landscape scale, freshwater, estuarine and coastal foreshore environments. So that taking a very holistic approach to make sure that we're covering most of our species as we work towards trying to generate a landscape scale method of targeting or addressing the kinds of issues that we need to address to secure our species for perpetuity. So while the Wildlife Connections Plan does not have any statutory effect, it really concentrates primarily on a non-statutory way Council and the community can enhance wildlife habitat. It's through these actions that we can start to review our Redland City Council plan to determine if there are any kinds of amendments needed for to our environmental overlays. So the Wildlife Connection Plan is in full swing. We to create the document, 5 categories were defined. The main categories, the first 3 categories were around establishing riparian and various coastal foreshore corridors and looking for established corridors with high ecological value and that offered strong wildlife movement opportunities. The other 2 areas where we focused on, which was our enhancement corridors and our stepping stone corridors, and these were to try to look where we could create sufficient linkage or where there was sufficient linkage to create and enhance opportunities to move species where we felt that it was most important. So those 5 categories help define the priority actions, which centre around improving our corridors habitat through rehabilitation and understanding where our gaps and pinch points are. Obviously, to try to mitigate wildlife deaths through really looking at how we can secure safe passage across roads and other barriers, reducing the impacts on corridors through our pest management and our for weeds and some of those other major areas around climate change, so storm and tide and sea level rise, and protecting our corridor habitat where we can through various amendments to our plans. So you can see by the picture here, the colours indicate some of the work that's been done to identify sort of core areas, core habitat at where we've got established corridors and where we can create other corridors, and trying to make sure that we have east-west and north-south linkages to ensure that there is enough availability for gene flow across our city. I'm not going to go into all of how the Wildlife Connection Plan was developed, but all of that information is on our website. So all the methodology and the variables and attributes that we looked at are all part of the methodology that are available on the Redland City Council's website, for those who are interested. For our priority area mapping, really what it did was allow us to, once we had established where our corridors should and could be, it gave us a representation where the science is dictating we should apply some efforts, and where the gaps are. And so in those little sort of circles, we've identified these are areas where we need to sort of focus some of our attention, and it gives us an opportunity to really focus in on how to inform our operational and our educational actions back to the community, so in a more timely manner. So once it's fair enough to identify these things, but the next part is really sort of making sure that we can action these and in a timely manner so that they're meaningful. So the SPA, Strategic Priority Mapping, basically underlines the principles of the SEQ Ecological Restoration Framework and our Conservation Land Management Strategy in 2010. And we separated it into two key regions, the primary region and the secondary region. The primary region identifies the critical environmental habitat values within the wildlife corridors, with the aim to conserve and enhance these really high value habitats. The secondary region identifies the high environmental values for threatened species within and outside the wildlife corridors. The aim of this layer really is to maintain and educate our community. So the strategic plan priority area mapping strengthens our ability to contribute to the goals and actions within the national and regional frameworks, and those include Australia's Strategy for Nature 2019 to 2030, our SEQ Ecological Restoration Framework, and the Queensland Invasive Plants and Animal Strategy 2019 and to 2024, and it fits with our current and future frameworks within the Redlands 2030 Community Plan, our Corporate Plan, obviously our natural environmental policies, our conservation land and management strategies, and the various strategies that I've already talked about, which is our Koala Conservation Strategy, Wildlife Connections Plan, the Biodiversity Plan, and our Basin Creek Plan. So we've got some really big objectives, and obviously at the centre of this is to connect core conservation areas across the city and increase the habitat and quality of that habitat over the next 5 to 10 years, and of course beyond. And that does include our riparian corridors. These objectives provides us with a council with a roadmap and for our residents and our stakeholders to focus and prioritise decisions and actions and our funding, and it acts as a key driver for council setting some of our environmental levies. With big ideas, big objectives come big ideas, and these big ideas are primarily centred on trying to take that broader landscape approach that I've been constantly talking about, and trying to look at it in a very holistic way by seeing where we can address and meet the threat mitigation, and by adopting programs like like nutritional ecology principles, where we can increase the carrying capacity for species, including the koala. So it looks like the slide won't come up in this presentation, but the next slide did show some work that we were doing, where we have selected an area in the city where we are looking at carrying capacity and identifying some of those key habitat trees and resource trees for koalas, looking at what that currently means to koala carrying capacity and what we can do around carrying capacity into the future if we follow the principles of nutritional ecology, so that we can make sure that what we're planting has a higher nutritional or value to our koala population. So not just planting for planting's sake, but planting trees and in a way that will have a broader and more meaningful outcome for those local koala populations. At the same time as planting more trees that have that allow us to carry more koalas, we need to think about these areas as sources. So we want to make sure that when these young koalas are moving out through the landscape, where they're moving to they can move safely. So that is all part of that sort of broader planning. So looking at areas, looking what we can do in those areas to increase the carrying capacity, and then once we've but also taking into consideration what happens once we've done that. So urban greening projects and rewilding projects, there's plenty of opportunities to undertake some of these projects across the Redlands, and a number of LGAs in SEQ and Australia and globally have been undertaking these sorts of urban greening projects with great success. We've identified areas in the city that we feel that would be beneficial and for those sort of urban greening projects, and we're seeking to look at working with private partners to create and improve the options and around some of these projects. So rather than waiting for things to happen, we know that planning and development are coming, and there's going to be new upgrades of roads or new roads being developed. So rather than waiting until those trees come down, we want to be ahead of that and years ahead of it, so that, you know, if we know that there's a development happening within the next 5 to 10 years, we can start to plan around that now and work with those developers, so that again we can increase and improve the kind of quality of habitat that they may be putting back in their environmental offsetting and some of the solutions. So there's plenty of opportunities we can see with all of that kind of thing. And the other part of these big ideas is to ensure that once we create these opportunities, it offers us an opportunity to enhance our recreation and tourism activities. So by taking this landscape approach and improving our natural habitats, we've got an opportunity not only to help retain and restore our natural areas and our species, but we've got an opportunity for people locals and tourists to enjoy those more effectively. Oh, sorry, there's the actual slide that I didn't think that was going to come up. So those blue dots represent a whole bunch of terra corner. So we've gone out and looked at every tree that's, this is for koalas, and on that patch of land we're also identifying what we can actually do to increase the carrying capacity. And as I said, but the flip side of that is once we create that, we've got to make sure that those animals can move in and out of those areas safely. So from the council's point of view, we've got a lot of big ideas, a lot of objectives, a lot of plans, and so this will be our future strategies, planning and policies will be based around trying to deliver a lot of these. Some of the, in terms of climate change and what we're looking at, some of the things, the initiatives that we're looking at is looking at trying to develop plans to cool our streets and provide better consideration to deal with those heat island impacts. A lot of focus around trees, shaded urban trees, pedestrian landscapes to provide that respite and to improve the usability and amenity of our areas. Looking at tree management guidelines to improve improvements to link back to our livable communities. And again, those greening projects, and I sort of alluded to this before, but the concrete drains, which we have quite a number of in Redlands, is a really a good opportunity to start to not only provide better community amenity, so bikeways, walkways, for people to enjoy, and not only because it will ensure that we can create linkages and reduce fragmentation, it allows us to really make those projects viable for the community, so they get a maximum benefit. And of course, as we've talked about throughout this presentation, the opportunity to try to deliver a more comprehensive threat management program, and which includes mitigation of roads, impacts of roads, is something that we will be really focusing on in the next few years. So it's time for questions, and what I'll do now is I'll go back to the video, and hopefully I can join people who've got any questions about what we've been talking about today. So thank you.
You've generated a couple of questions. It's good to have you here in person, but also thanks so much for preparing that that video presentation. A couple of questions. We've got a question here related to what size do you think corridors need to be in terms of their length and width to generate the optimal outcomes for wildlife? So I think you talked a little bit about connecting landscapes. Is there some additional information you could share about the approach you're using to set up corridors and some of the thinking?
Thanks, Jeff. Look, I can't really give a categorical answer to that. I think it's in a situation of fragmented landscape, we have to take what we've got and develop around what we have. So we've been looking at what we have, and I know that there's research that talks about potentially ideal sizes for corridors, but I think the lesson that I see from species is that they'll take what they get. And so we're taking that approach. But whatever we can do to create these corridors and enhance linkages is the strategy we're taking, because of places like the Redlands are very fragmented. And I know that's not quite a good answer, but it's the best I can do.
No, that's fine. I think you've hit the nail on the head anyway, in that in terms of talking around corridors, depends on what scale we're planning corridors. We can have regional corridors to try and connect landscapes at the regional scale. We can have them at sub-regional scale, so potentially at a local government area where you're trying to improve connections between isolated habitat, and then you can have it at local scale. So the size and width of those will depend on, I guess, the ultimate aim. And then the other issue, I guess, is that in some instances we'll actually provide just stepping stones. So retaining small patches of habitat and providing connecting trees in some of those urban landscapes is equally as important. We've got another question here, which is very specific to Redlands, which is around Toondah Harbour. And the question is, are there plans to plant out Raby Esplanade to provide habitat to assist koalas that are impacted by that development?
Look, I think Toondah Harbour, there's quite a lot of planning in the background going on there. It's not something that I'm privy to and able to talk about in this forum, but I do know that there is quite a lot of work going on in the background about how to secure that current koala population. and to try to manage that koala population into the future so that there are some decent outcomes. So it's a sustainable population there. But to the finer details, I can't provide that in this forum.
No, that's fine, Kath. I'm sure there are opportunities for people to access that information from websites and other documents that relate to that specific development. So thanks again for your presentation and for your time with questions this morning. That will finish this session. Anyone who wants to join in to the next session, again, please return to the timeline and we'll see you shortly. Thanks.
Thank you.
Yeah, good morning, everyone, and welcome back to the third presentation of today's KoalaCollab Conference Series. Our third presentation is by Chris Evenson. We'll talk about the Department of Environment and Science koala habitat restoration projects. Chris's current position within the Queensland Parks and Wildlife Service and Partnerships Division is as a Program Coordinator for koala habitat partnerships and programs, and it's supporting actions identified in the SEQ Koala Conservation Strategy. Chris has been working for the State of Queensland in ag and conservation related roles for 44 years, and over that time he's been consciously developing and sharing collective knowledge and understanding of landscape and species conservation through action and extension. Chris's life adventure has taken him from native pasture grazing management research to the establishment of the Ramsar-listed Currawinja National Park and to the negotiation of nature refuges Queensland-wide, large and small, on private land. The challenge of koala habitat restoration and regeneration in SEQ is certainly a complex one involving a very wide range of organisations, projects and programs dealing with the constant demands and pressure of an ever-growing population. Chris's talk will explore whether partnerships can connect these opportunities and hence the great work that is occurring in SEQ to share knowledge, experience and resources for bigger, better koala habitat outcomes. So look forward to Chris's presentation.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, from the sunny, slightly overcast Gold Coast today. I'd just like to, before I start, I'd like to acknowledge the Kumpumerri families of the Yugambeh language group as the traditional owners and custodians of this land from which I'm speaking this morning. I'd like to pay respects to the elders past and present for their wisdom and teaching of cultural knowledge. Rightio. So today, as Jeff had quite nicely introduced me, I'd like to talk to you a little about some of the koala habitat restoration programs that have been occurring within DES and are going to occur into the future. In particular, I'd like to tell you the tale of a story this morning about a project that's been going since around about 2010, to give you an example of some of the habitat restoration experiences that we've been growing and learning, and perhaps even challenge you with some questions at the end of this. I'd also like to take you forward into where we're heading under the new koala the koala conservation strategy. So the direction of the group with which I work. But before I start that, I'd just like to, I think anybody that's been watching the CoLab has seen some wonderful work happening across all the different areas and aspects of koala conservation. And in particular today, I'd just like to thank everybody that's planted a tree, started the project, whether they're a small community group in their small backyard, right through to some of the bigger projects that are occurring across the region. So some of the projects like the one that Dennis described this morning with Healthy Land and Water. Other projects that have been occurring with bushfire recovery funding that's come from the federal government. So all projects, great and small, I think, thank you to anybody that's putting a tree in the ground to help koala habitat. So as I mentioned before, there are three things that I would like to speak to you about this morning. The first one is the Koala Habitat Restoration Program, and I'll get straight into that pretty soon. From 2010 to 21, where we're at with that project. The Koala Habitat Partnerships and Programs Group, where we've come from and where we're going to. And also I'd like to introduce you to a new way of delivering koala habitat restoration projects across the region through a project that we're piloting with Queensland Trust for Nature. So stepping back in time, folks, back to 2010, when the government was looking to do something in the way of improving koala habitat across South East Queensland. A project was started, and the project aimed to establish a number of properties, purchase them freehold for the state, and then try and rehabilitate those properties from whatever condition they were in. Most of the properties had been used for agriculture at some stage and were quite cleared and well developed with pasture. So the history had gone right back, well back into the 50s in many cases, and earlier where the properties had been cleared. The works, the idea of the project was that the works would be funded as an offset for state government projects. So state government entities who wished to enter into the project could contribute an offset for anything that they were clearing. So maybe a school was clearing ground for new sports fields, or for buildings, or a police station was building new buildings or developing. They could contribute their offset into an account that we used to actually get the trees and the habitat in the ground. So obviously the purpose of this was to create additional habitat. We managed to, and sort of preempting the end of the story, we got to 82,000 trees planted on the official account and up and running. We may have planted a few more trees than that along the way, which resulted in 509 hectares of land that was rehabilitated. In addition to that, we did some repair work in riparian areas and any of the remnant areas. So getting into the weeds in those areas and perhaps introducing some species that hadn't been there for quite some time. In the end, we want to protect those plantings well into the future, and there's already been discussions about how you do protect any plantings in previous presentations today. To give you an idea of the spread of the properties that were purchased, so the charter of the first group was to go out and buy some properties across South East Queensland that would be suitable for habitat restoration. that's no easy feat. And in 2010, it was probably harder because they had to go back to some pretty basic or straightforward tools when it came to mapping, and particularly the identification of regional ecosystems and the details that go into what's happening across the countryside. They didn't have the modern GIS type tools that we've now got. And I'll harken back to the start of this collab where we were talking about the mapping and our sophisticated mapping that we have these days. The group also had to not only find properties that were suitable, but then see if the properties were for sale. And in many cases, they may not have been. They had to see whether the properties would suit our purpose in quite a bit of detail. So there was a lot of study done on each of these properties in a very rapid time. But in 3 years, they managed to grab a bunch of good properties. To the north of SEQ, we have the Cromhurst property, which will be the one that I'll be featuring a little bit today. We have a couple of properties in the Peachester area. And of note there, I was speaking to a bulldozer driver in recent times who we'd employed to do some work on a fence line for us. And he said that his family had actually cleared those particular properties 4 times in the last couple of generations for various escapades, particularly with pine plantations. To the south, we have a group of properties, and they sit in Redlands and Brisbane City and Logan Shires. We have Avalon Road. It features a bunch of beautiful dams, but the property was completely set up for a grazing enterprise. So we had to revert that back from a grazing enterprise. Mount View was a small property, smaller property, which had been used as a farm over time and came with some interesting toxic waste issues. Not only was the building full of asbestos, but the farmer had sumped and kept sumped all the oil that was ever used on the property, which he would have used, I imagine, for preserving timber structures on the property. But that sump was sitting in the middle of the household area of the property. So that's an example of one of the challenges that you get when you're trying to rehabilitate a property. The people that actually got out and bought these properties were really quite clever, and they used a lot of energy to do that. And one of the big features that they were looking for was to not only to find places suitable to repair, but how those properties sat within the landscape when it came to connectivity of other protected areas or other large stands of remnant vegetation. I bring your attention to the property here, Cromhurst, which was the one I'm going to feature today, which sits just below, this is Mullaney up here, and Mary Cairns Cross Scenic Reserve there. So Cromhurst actually links the Glasshouse Mountains National Park, this area here, down through to Cromhurst State Forest. It then links across to an ecological reserve that the council manages, back to a conservation park, which is National Parks and Wildlife Services responsibility. It's very close to Car Hill Scrub here, and it moves on across remnant timber to the other environmental reserves, making quite an amazing linkage across the landscape. So when you tool back to where we were looking before across the whole of SEQ, you get an idea of the size of the landscape and how little the property looks in there. But when you actually come down to the local landscape size, you can see the significance of the purchase of this property. Okay, so this is just a quick example of the kind of research that was done on each property that was purchased and the properties that weren't purchased but were assessed. It came down to the level of what species that we felt we needed to plant in the area to start our habitat restoration. It listed the common weeds that we were going to face as we took on the properties and we started the planning towards it. And it also went to the level of looking at planting compartments so that planning could be done across the property over time to maximise the efficiency of our efforts. So what did we learn along the way? And unfortunately, I can't tell you the whole details of all the properties or even this particular property. I'm going to have to précis that for this presentation. What we learned along the way was that you could take a property that was well developed for pasture for agricultural purposes. So in 2014, that's what the property looked like. You look at this picture, And in 2020, you could actually start to progress the rehabilitation of that area quite significantly, and to the stage where you could actually put in other management or start considering other methods of management to maintain that stand of vegetation that you're trying to grow. There were a lot of challenges along the way, and each of the properties was pretty raw when we purchased them. They'd been, I guess, developed over a long period of time, and some things had come and gone. We needed to make sure that we could access the properties so that we could do the planting safely, and we could go back and do our maintenance safely. So there was a lot of work done in the way of road track development, making sure that we could access the areas without too much drama. There was obviously site preparation. So in some places it included ripping, maybe some spot spraying, and it obviously very heavy slashing to ensure that the competition was suppressed as much as possible while we got our plantings in place. There were places where we planted wetlands, which were ex-dams that had silted up and weren't of any use anymore, which we opened up the drainage on, and then we got stuck into trying to rehabilitate the bottoms of dams. There were fence lines and boundary tracks, as I just mentioned before, that needed work. In some cases, dam bywashes, we had erosion issues where we needed to come up with sensible solutions to rehabilitate them. I haven't got a photo of that area rehabilitated, but what we did was we flat drained that bywash of the dam, rocks, and then a whole heap of wetland species in there with some geo material underneath. We're able to make that into quite a happy little habitat for frogs and quite an efficient drain that doesn't erode anymore. We were constantly fighting this issue, which in the wonderful part of South East Queensland, grasses grow like mad when you add rain, particularly if the pastures have been developed for agriculture. And we still have challenges ahead. Now the stands of trees are up, we're getting on top of the grass issue, but we still have challenges ahead managing that. I'll mention a little bit about that in a second. We had to demolish and remove a number of buildings, and all of them were old buildings, and all of them had some sort of toxic issue. They weren't worth keeping, to value add to the property into the future. So we were responsible owners and removed those properly, particularly the asbestos and hazardous substances were, I guess, removed properly. And the result, obviously, is this wonderful growth of trees, which is occurring across most of the properties now very well. We're still doing a little bit of infill. So our learnings were that sourcing the land wasn't as easy as you might think. So if I threw a heap of money at you tomorrow and asked you to go out and find some properties that you could buy to do this kind of work, you need to factor in a lot of time to prepare and to wait for properties to come onto the market. Recovering the land is expensive. Fighting the established uses of those properties, removing the waste that was there, making the land suitable to manage, and I guess attractive for future owners has taken a lot of time and energy. Pre and post weed management, as anybody who's done habitat restoration in South East Queensland can tell you, it's the constant bugbear. It's a never-ending story until you really get your trees up and established properly, and you can ease back. Creekline habitat restoration, we've capitalised on areas that were in good condition and added plants like Parastolochia, bird-wing butterfly vine. We've done some strategic plantings of other plants that needed to be in there and removed any weed species along the way. Not specifically for koala habitat, but for habitat in general. The wonderful thing about a couple of our creek lines is that we do have active platypus colonies living in them. And one of the wonderful byproducts of this is that over time, we've run about 30 staff through this program. We've trained a bunch of very good land restorers and land managers to become rangers in QPWS, and also picked up jobs in private industry doing habitat restoration. What are some of our future tricks? Well, at the moment we're in partnership with the Maloney State High School, who have happen to have a drought master stud and needed an overflow area to hold some of their stock. And we're using their stock at the moment to experiment with how hard we can graze, how well we can graze, and how young the trees need to be while we're grazing paddocks that we're rehabilitating. Makes it a lot cheaper. We're not spending money slashing areas, and we're getting quite a good result for the cooperative advantage of working with a great little school. Controlled fire, we've only just started in that area, and that's an open book. How can we use fire to our advantage? Definitely wildfire is a consideration for us, but we haven't had to use controlled burns previously to stave off or prepare for wildfire. We're sort of considering more from the point of view of how do we use it to manipulate the regrowth to our advantage. What's happening here? I'm just trying to get this. Oh, here we go. So what I would like to, I'd just like to jump out of that project and jump into another one that's been happening in the background in more recent times, just as an example of other areas of habitat restoration in South East Queensland. The Land Restoration Fund has just got or has established a project in cohorts with SEQ Water, where 170 hectares of area has been revegetated for koala habitat with 150,000 trees. Once the tree growth it matures, it's going to produce around about 52,000 ACCUs, which are certainly a very valuable carbon credit. And I guess steps us towards, there is an interest in the carbon offset market within SEQ. It's just how we get that to work on smaller properties. Stepping out of that one and into something a little bit I guess just an introduction, is the Koala Habitat Restoration Partnerships and Programs team. We've come from that previous project, and we're now moving under the direction of the under the guidance of the Koala Conservation Strategy, and our role is definitely to assist with the commencement of the rehabilitation of restoring 10,000 hectares of koala habitat in SEQ. And when my boss told me about this, I said we're going to need a lot more tree guards. That's a joke. From the serious end of our business, we want to contribute to fulfilling that target. We want to share our experiences and build partnerships to improve the delivery of new and restored koala habitat across SEQ, and particularly, obviously, the strategy area. We want to maximise our opportunities to rehabilitate land on state-owned land, and we're just starting into the planning stages of that project. And where possible, we want to facilitate rehabilitation projects between the state, LGAs and private partners. To finish my presentation today, I'd just like to introduce you to a pilot project that has started, triggered by the efforts of the conservation strategy. And that project is a partnership with Queensland Trust for Nature. I'm not going to go into the details of this because Ian Wheatland in the next section will detail what is happening actually there. This project started off in 2019 as a simple, how do we deliver cash to the ground, get trees in the ground as rapidly as possible. It's expanded as of mid-2021, and that expansion has allowed the funding of more habitat restoration projects on the ground in partnership with councils specifically, and also the establishment of some work to look at facilitating the development of test models for how carbon farming projects on small properties could work in South East Queensland. I'm going to let Ian, this is the segue to Ian's session, I guess. I'm going to let him fill out the dots that are probably going on in your mind there. So in summary, we've built a lot of experience through buying, owning land that we've rehabilitated, which I should just finish the proposal for those properties. We have to find a home for them, and we're in the throes of doing that at the moment. Eventually, those trees will be protected by nature refuge when they go to a new owner, when the land goes to a new owner, and that'll be in perpetuity. One of the properties we rehabilitated, Ford Road, became part of the Venmans National Park network, and it's one of our most successful purchases, that it was able to transition directly into National Park via being a conservation park initially. So we need to find a home for those. We're moving on to deliver and support the delivery of habitat restoration across SEQ in our new guys. And finally, we have a trial project going on, which is already scored Queensland Trust for Nature. And with that, I will finish my talk.
Thanks, Chris. It's certainly a long journey you've painted for everyone there, but also I think highlights the extent to which there are habitat restoration activities going on throughout SEQ. We've probably got time just for one question, and I think you've probably covered that a little bit. Somebody was just talking about the history, the subsequent fate of these properties and measures to secure the work that's been undertaken.
Yep. So definitely the efforts to in this particular case, because the state owned the land, there are a very limited number of ways that we can protect those plantings into the future. And one, as I mentioned before, was the integration of a block into the protected area estate, which is the Ford Road block. And we're able to do that with that. The intention originally when they purchased the properties was hoping that each one of those properties could become or contribute to the protected area estate. Unfortunately, though, some of the properties are too small. Some of them don't fit the management unit needs or the needs of the national parks in the areas that we're in. That doesn't belie their importance when it comes to being habitat, koala habitat. Those ones will be protected once we've secured a future for each of those blocks by nature refuge, as I suggested before. We will announce, or the Minister will announce sometime before the end of the year, we hope, what happens with each of those blocks of land.
Okay, yeah, no, I'm aware that an announcement is imminent, so we're hopeful that can go public to, again, provide further evidence of how we're securing and protecting those areas. Unfortunately, we're going to have to leave it there. There are a few more questions that we'll get Chris to respond to through the Q&A, but also there's opportunities to connect with Chris through the hub. So thanks again, Chris. And if you want to join us for the next session from QTFN, please jump back into the timeline and join that session. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Yeah, good morning and welcome back for the final presentation of today's KoalaCollab Conference Series. Our final presentation for today, as previewed by Chris Evenson in the previous presentation, is by Ian Wheatland, and Ian will be talking around the Koala Habitat Restoration Partnership Program on behalf of the Queensland Trust for Nature. Ian's an experienced project manager with over 10 years practice applying his knowledge of fire ecology and vegetation dynamics to specialised ecosystem restoration initiatives. In his current role at the Queensland Trust for Nature, Ian manages a suite of projects employing targeted restoration actions to reconstruct, enhance and maintain threatened species habitats. A central pillar of the land's current works is the Koala Habitat Restoration Partnership Project, a 5-year, $4.9 million project funded by the Queensland Government to restore koala habitat across South East Queensland. Look forward to Ian's presentation.
Okay, thank you very much for the introduction there, Jeff. It's a pleasure to be here, and I really appreciate the presentation so far. We've heard some great things about koala restoration that's occurring across South East Queensland, and certainly some really good works going on, both in restoration and Catherine's presentation and from Chris, we're seeing some very important strategic work also happening at the same time, which is fantastic. So I'm Ian, I'm from Queensland Trust for Nature, and I've been administering the Koala Habitat Restoration Partnership Program, which is a $4.93 million project funded by the Queensland Government, being delivered by Queensland Trust and Trust for Nature to restore koala habitats in the region. Okay, so the program commenced in June 2019. Principles of the program are for the restoration of koala habitat as a primary. We're creating new habitat through revegetation that's carefully designed to actually get the best that we can for koalas in the areas that we're restoring. That revegetation is taking a staged approach. Our other mechanism for restoration is through assisted natural regeneration and taking regenerated vegetation from a state of sort of early development through to enhanced restoration actions to maximise the value of that recovering habitat for koalas. As you would imagine, as vegetation regenerates, you don't necessarily get the best outcomes unless you're assisting that process to ensure that you're favouring the habitat characteristics that you're trying to achieve. So through those two mechanisms, revegetation and assisted natural regeneration is how we're achieving the koala restoration. Now, we do have a significant focus on connectivity in the identification of projects and the design of those projects in the early phases to try to maximise connectivity through the landscape with a respect of the existing core remnant habitats. Another core principle that we have is to make sure that we're engaging all of the key stakeholders. As we're aware from the expert panel report and of common sense and the complexities of koala conservation across the region, it's really important that all stakeholders are considered. All levels of government, NGOs, knowledge within the community, universities, researchers, there's knowledge everywhere, and it's important that we try to access and utilise all of that knowledge and experience that's there, usually with a good amount of goodwill to contribute. One of the significant advantages of this program is that it is a 5-year duration, which gives us the ability to work with land for a longer period of time than a lot of other programs in order to ensure that we're achieving long-term outcomes. So in 2019, we started with an initial funding of 1.96 million, and that's resulted in 7 projects being commenced in 2020. These 7 projects are located across the region within 5 different local government areas. The map presented there shows the existing core koala habitat and where the sites are located as to how we're seeing that connectivity being achieved and maximised through the site. And as I move through my presentation showcasing these projects, that core habitat will be represented on all the landscape mapping. What QTFN thinks we bring to this project is our existing industry partnerships, government partnerships, and relationships. And this has been key in the establishment of these 7 sites. And another aspect there is the ongoing monitoring undertaken from the outset on different aspects of habitat quality to see how we're going in terms of establishing that habitat with the different techniques that we're using. And I'll discuss some of those techniques as I move through my presentation, referring to the specific sites. Through the partnerships in these projects, so we started with 1.96 million for the establishment of these 7 projects, and our partners have bought almost $1 million, 0.97 million plus in-kind labour, which would tip it over that mark. So we've managed to bring in a significant amount of co-funding for these projects to supplement the money that the state government's invested. And moving into the future, the state government, under the recent budget, has contributed 2.97 million of additional funding to the program. And we're going through a phase at the moment of figuring out what the best way to deliver that funding will be. So there'll be news in 2022 as to where we're moving in that regard. So project site selection. In the initial phases of developing the program, we developed an assessment methodology, and I'll get onto the specifics of that in a moment. Following the commencement of the program, we put out an expression of interest to the public generally and to local governments and other interested parties in the region to try to identify different koala habitat projects that might be available. In that process, we released the expression of interest in the summer of 2019, in December 2019, when the terrible fires were occurring. And that really generated a very large amount of interest. We received 245 project inquiries and 71 formal project proposals. It was really heartening at this point in time to see how many people had a very strong interest in koala conservation, and most people really wanting to contribute something themselves, whether that was their land or whether that was their time to try to assist in the recovery of the species. So following the expression of interest process, we ran the 71 project proposals through a desktop analysis, which is part of our assessment methodology to better understand whether projects have a feasibility when it comes to contributing to recovering the koala as a species in the region. From this desktop assessment, we ended up with 31 projects that had significant potential for koala habitat restoration, and those 31 projects were then subject to a site assessment under our assessment framework to determine the quantified amount of koala habitat gain that a project may achieve. Following the site assessment and determining how much koala habitat gain might be achieved by the proposed projects, we applied a cost feasibility analysis to ensure that we're getting sort of the maximum return for the money invested in the projects. This resulted in the 7 projects being identified across the 5 local government areas. Moving to our assessment framework, this table gives an overview of the assessment methodology that we are using. The site context section at the top, under the overall score, is given a weighting of 2 out of 10. That desktop assessment was also used for identification of sites that were considered feasible for site assessment. That site context score or desktop assessment considered the size of the habitat patch, the connectedness and connectivity, and whether the area was occurring in existing habitat mapping layers. Under site assessment, we developed a methodology which is based around the biocondition method, focusing in on aspects of that habitat analysis that indicates habitat quality for koalas. So we were looking at recruitment, tree canopy height to look at aspects of maturity, canopy cover, how many large trees are in that area already, the percentage of weeds. We were focusing only on weed species that were degrading koala habitat. How many food trees per hectare, age structure of canopy trees. And we're also at that point looking at koala populations. So we're undertaking what's called a SAT assessment, a site assessment technique, within the project area to determine koala presence. Moving on now to our 7 sites. I'll give you a quick overview of those sites, where they're located, and a bit of a description of the project itself. So our first site is located on Danger Bridge Nature Refuge. We see this project as a showcase of the program. It is located obviously in quite a substantial core area. The property was a grazing property up until the current landholder purchased the property and is intending to regenerate almost the entire property. As you can see, the mapped core koala habitat in the area is substantial. There are koalas recorded in the local area, and we have recorded koalas on and adjacent to the property. The blue areas in these maps as I'm moving forward are the project restoration areas. That indicates areas that we're undertaking either revegetation or assisted natural regeneration. So for the purposes of this, we can assume that there will be koala habitat strategically designed and targeted for establishment in those areas. So obviously from this map, you can really see the extent of infill and improvement of connectivity of that koala habitat in the landscape. The project consists of 72.6 hectares of koala habitat that's under restoration. This area has been subject to revegetation, supplementary planting and weed control since the project's inception in January last year. The habitat of the site is considered to be high suitability and very good quality habitat for koala. This picture gives you a bit of an idea of the existing landscape in the largest revegetation zone. And the management actions that are undertaken. We are undertaking broad acre revegetation, supplementary planting and weed eradication to ensure that koalas are able to disperse through the habitat with ease. The project is a partnership between the Queensland Government, us at Queensland Trust for Nature, Green Fleet, who is a carbon trading organisation, an NGO that trades in carbon, that has contributed to the project through the sale of the carbon credits. And we're partnering with Noosa District Landcare, who are undertaking the restoration actions and revegetation on the property. On to our next site. Site here, this is Hidden Vale Nature Refuge. The property is owned by the Turner Family Foundation, and it's a very well-known property. People would know the Hidden Vale Station and the great works that they've been doing with koalas out there. Again, you can see the site and the area to be restored, connecting habitats of the Little Liverpool Range out onto the floodplains of Sandy Creek. This connectivity is highly valuable in that area and does cross over the creek and riparian zone in order to connect those habitats. Again, we've got different partners on this project. We've got the Queensland Government obviously contributing, QTFN undertaking administrative and on-ground actions. Green Fleet is also again contributing to the project from a financial and an administrative capacity to mobilise additional finance. And the University of Queensland has come on board with us to contribute quite significantly to undertaking on long-term monitoring and research program on the property. The project consists of 27.6 hectares of koala habitat revegetation or assisted regeneration. The project will create corridors across the floodplain and restore habitats along the creek and riparian zone, contributing to connectivity in multiple different directions and habitat types. And again, we're dealing with high suitability koala habitat. The management actions undertaken, we're undertaking broad acre revegetation across the floodplain, riparian habitat recovery, supplementary planting along the riparian zone, and weed control to reduce impacts on existing habitat and to improve koala movement through those habitats. I suppose this photo shows a really interesting perspective of the project. The project, being a research plot, has been undertaken in a grid format in order to undertake monitoring of that project. So the woodland diversity study that's occurring on site is being coordinated and run by Dr. John Dwyer at the University of Queensland. And the study aims to derive different information from different techniques applied to different research plots across the planting area. One of the more interesting aspects of that is looking at climate-adjusted provenancing, so looking at getting species from different areas across the region to see whether individual characteristics are influencing the success of that project. Other aspects of the study there is looking at whether the provision of soil inoculation from nearby intact woodlands to increase the amount of soil microbes within the soil of the revegetation area does improve or enhance that process. And also looking in some aspects of different species mixes to see whether any plant functional groups or types are contributing more significantly than others to the long-term establishment and survival of the species. Moving on to the next project, Sundara Retreat up in Black Mountain in the Noosa hinterland. This project's a little smaller in size, but quite important in the local landscape. The Sundara Retreat, owned by Joe Verrar and Heidi DeWald, they have been undertaking restoration actions on their property for a number of years, and the regeneration which has occurred under their ownership is fantastic. The project is again a partnership between the Queensland Government, the Sundara Retreat, Queensland Trust for Nature, Noosa Council, who's contributing some funding to the project and also administering legal protection for the project, and Noosa and District Landcare, who are undertaking the works on the ground. The local landscape, as you can see, the koala habitat is somewhat patchy in places. The area does have a patchwork of wet eucalypt forest, dry eucalypt forest and rainforest, depending on the aspect and topography and geography of the site. The project will be contributing significantly to increasing the habitat connectivity through the existing habitats by revegetation of a ridge, a northern exposed ridge, which is appropriate for koala habitat. The project is 8.28 hectares of koala habitat, so it's smaller, as I said, but quite important in terms of the landscape functionality. And again, we're dealing with high suitability koala habitat with tallow woods and grey gums and other really important koala species. And I suppose a little window into the project there. You can see the northern faced ridge that's been revegetated there. We undertook a community planting. The landholder undertook most of the planning for that and mobilised local the local community, and that was a great day. We got a lot of trees planted in that time. Again, the project is revegetation, weed eradication, and supplementary planting. On to our next site. This is a property called Woodstock, which is located down near the base of Tamborine Mountain on the Albert River. The project is a partnership between Queensland Government, Queensland Trust for Nature, and the property owner, the Youth Enterprise Trust Foundation. The Youth Enterprise Trust undertakes significant works in the community to try to connect troubled youth to environmental and land management, agricultural, education, and other outdoor activities. The project can be seen as a floodplain and riparian restoration project. The project sits within, or maybe slightly adjacent to, but within a state significant corridor, and obviously occurs just south of some of the Yarrabilba developments. So the property as a community resource and a biodiversity resource existing with a significant amount of riparian frontage will become more and more important in the future as the Yarrabilba development expands. The project consists of 47.16 hectares of koala habitat to be restored, and we're dealing with high suitability koala habitat. The project itself, the management actions are revegetation and connecting corridors across the floodplain and across the property, and the restoration of riparian habitat. Riparian habitats on the property have a very large amount of riparian weeds, and the protection of existing large koala trees in that area is of great importance. Moving on to our next project there. Project is partnership between Queensland Government, Queensland Trust for Nature, and the Scenic Rim Regional Council. The property is Kilmore Reserve, occurring at the base of Tamborine Mountain. As you can see from the landscape perspectives there, the connectivity, or the site is connected to large areas of core habitat. The project consists of 10.78 hectares of habitat restoration, and in areas of high suitability koala habitat. Again, a nice aerial of the planting area there, and you can see Tamborine Mountain sort of falling up in, rising up in the background there. The management actions on the site are revegetation, weed tree replacement. There are currently camphor laurels and other weed tree species that we are transitioning towards koala habitat. There are also large existing eucalyptus terreticornis or Queensland blue gum on the creek lines there. We are also in the project protecting a flying fox roost and buffer planting that to protect the grey-headed flying fox roost. On to our next project, Mount Mellon Nature Refuge, owned by Ian and Christine McMaster. Private property. The area that we are working in is 9.96 hectares of restoration and habitat that's suitable for koala. This project will obviously reinforce a significant core koala habitat area, as you can see from the mapping. A significant part of this project is the transition of an area that's been planted with that has large established slash pine plantation. Those pines will be stem injected and transitioned to a koala appropriate koala appropriate habitat. And our last project here, this project is at Ivory's Rock Convention Centre. Again, you can see that it's in a significant corridor and connected to large area of koala core habitat area. This project's quite a large one, 73.18 hectares in size. It consists of a patchwork of suitable and high suitability koala habitat. The management actions that we'll be undertaking are cool mosaic burning, direct seeding, supplementary planting, and we'll be undertaking some weed control trials for controlling creeping lantana on the property. Okay, so future directions of our program, 2022 to 2024. Obviously, we've had this injection by the Queensland Government, investing another $2.97 million in the program, which gives us a real ability to increase the amount of koala habitat restoration activities. We're currently consulting stakeholders, particularly local government, to try to integrate with the different works that those local governments are doing, similar to what Catherine had presented, and trying to really gain that knowledge and inject that knowledge into our program for the better targeted restoration actions. We will be partnering with DES, local governments, NGOs and the community to deliver koala education and citizen science programs, and they'll be scaling out as a result of as early as next year. And as Chris mentioned in his previous presentation, we will be developing methods for integrating carbon farming into our koala restoration projects, on top of what were the partnerships that we've already been entering into, to try and establish models for the future for supplementing the cost of koala restoration delivery, particularly for smaller projects. Really looking at trying to see if we can try to aggregate carbon projects to achieve local scale koala connectivity initiatives. I suppose last of all, just want to put a big thank you out to all of our partners for our existing projects. And that brings me to the end of my presentation.
Thanks very much, Ian. Yeah, thanks, Ian. Again, your presentation has sort of complemented the others and really wrapped up a great session this morning about the work that's being done in relation to koala habitat restoration. A couple of quick questions for you. One was, during the course of your presentation, you mentioned about koala habitat gain. The question was, is that estimate there based on an area calculation or based on the number of habitat trees?
Okay, so yes, the koala habitat gain is something that is calculated under our assessment framework, which is a framework that we're using to monitor project sites, but also to identify what projects are more highly valued than others. That assessment framework undertakes analysis of those different aspects of habitat that are important to koalas that I'd mentioned there. So essentially we undertake an assessment of the site as it exists, and then we estimate how that site will change under the management that's being administered, and we calculate what we consider to be a gain. And so that provides an objective approach to demonstrate to us what kind of koala habitat gain is being achieved under that program. And then we times that by the amount that we're getting in terms of area, in terms of the hectares of that project area, which gives us an overall estimate of the gain that's being produced for comparison against other projects.
That's great. Your talk's obviously generated a bit of interest. We've actually got a question here that is it possible for companies to get involved in these projects, and who do they contact? Some of the questions relate to companies that are already involved in community programs. I guess they're just interested in how do they access or gain access to QTFN projects.
Look, absolutely. I mean, we're very agile in our approach to delivering outcomes. Obviously, we are primarily focused on the delivery of koala habitat restoration. However, obviously, I've mentioned there that we're also entering into aspects of community events, public education, citizen science. So there's a lot of opportunities for the community and for companies to contribute, and we're certainly open to any ideas that people might have, or if they're wanting to contribute in some way to specific projects or new projects, then yeah, please get in contact with us at info@qtfn.org.au.
That's great. There's a question just with regards to what is the mapping you're using to look at core koala habitat?
So we are currently using a range of different mapping products. We are using the mapping layers under the Koala Conservation Strategy, both the core habitat areas and the locally refined habitat areas. And we're also using the Koala Priority Area and the Koala Habitat Restoration Area that is under the Koala Strategy. Obviously, these mapping layers are quite important in terms of bringing everyone into the same sort of way of thinking about how we're delivering and where is appropriate for achieving outcomes. However, we are also undertaking other aspects of mapping through different GIS analytics of Landsat and other habitat functions to give us more information as to the connectivity of sites in specific areas that contribute to our assessment score.
That's great. Thanks, Ian. We've exhausted our time for this morning's whole session. I think everyone will agree that these presentations have been fantastic and complementary, and certainly indicate the range of work that's being done in the koala habitat restoration area. So thank everyone for their attendance this morning, and thank Ian again for his presentation. Thanks, everyone.